Okay, that's 200 in the conference already, so we'll make a start. Thanks for being prompt, everybody. And what a very good morning it is to you all. My name is Mark Turner from the Supply Chain Sustainability School. We're here to talk about the complex, challenging, fascinating, and increasingly timely topic of reporting and disclosure on nature-related impacts, nature positive. And we're here for an hour and a half, no longer. So we have a hard stop at 11:30. So if you have questions, get them in early, and then you've got a better chance of getting them answered. That's me. I look after those groups on behalf of the school. I also look after the school's nature group. What I would say to you, we're going to do a couple of quick polls at the start. Please join in those polls. They're just Zoom polls, but we want to try and gauge our audience. We've got a huge audience today, and we want to kind of gauge the level of knowledge and progress in this area. And then, if possible, try and do that at the end as well. We're going to share all the content afterwards. You'll not only get the slides, which have a lot of complex detail on them, so you will need to examine those afterwards, I think, and share them. But we'll also issue a recording, so you'll be able to get to that recording. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I think we're going to have the facility there to upvote those questions. So if you can upvote the questions you would most like to see answered rather than putting in a new question, that's helpful because it helps us refine numbers. Here is our agenda in our panel today. So I'm doing the intros. We're going to do some quick polls, as I said, at the moment. Then we're going to hear from Charlie Dixon and Hannah Murray of the GFI. GFI have been absolutely fantastic with the school over the last year, giving us a lot of support in understanding this area. So you will get a thorough introduction from Charlie and Hannah on TNFD and the built environment and where the whole thing is. Not just in terms of, like, if you like, our sector, but also elsewhere in the world and in other comparative and peer sectors. We're then going to move on to some specific examinations of corporate commitment to TNFD, and those will come from Ben Stone, who's also coincidentally the school chair on nature recovery, and Ruth Voigt from Laing O'Rourke. So that will be very useful as well, obviously, for you, because you can see organisations that have put their head above the parapet in this area. And after that, we're going to hear from Julia Baker and Kate Swan from Mott MacDonald. Now, I have to give a big shout out to Kate and Julia, because Mott's have been absolutely fabulous over the last year and since the inception of our nature recovery group within the school. Helped us with a number of our webinars and some great content, and you'll get a real feel on the kind of the consultant's role and how partnering can work in this area. And then we're going to make a little bit of a kind of a slight change, because you're going to hear from Gabby Graham from the Wildlife Trust. And this is interesting because Gabby's going to talk about the Wildlife Trust biodiversity benchmark. So it's one thing to be reporting on stuff, but it's another thing again to actually be doing stuff and then evidencing what you're doing. So I think that will be really interesting. It might give you some thoughts on practical actions you can take as organisations. We're then going to move swiftly to panel discussion and Q&A. We hope to get to the panel discussion and Q&A by 11 a.m, but we'll see how we go, because we've got a lot to get through. So without further ado, we're going to press on with our first poll. So please participate in these. It's really helpful. It gives our panel a good feel for where you're at with the topic, and we do get a range of people on these events. So you can see how that's starting to settle already. Delighted to see we've got somebody who's looking to lead. Always good to be ambitious, but most of you starting out and beginning to get to grips with it. Let's let that run a few seconds more. Fantastic participation in the poll, by the way. That's absolutely brilliant, folks. Look at that. We've got 308 on the call and over 260 of you who have responded. Okay, I think that gives us that feel, doesn't it? So if you kind of take a mental picture of that panel, because you're going to need it, and we'll move on. So let's ask our next question. And this is about making a corporate commitment on nature. So if you like, reaching into the topic a little bit more, and you're going to hear a lot about this topic this morning. And by the way, while this is running in, just to let you know that this isn't all we're going to be doing on this. We're going to be coming back to this, I'm sure, under Ben's chair within our group and through the school and elsewhere organisationally. We're going to make sure that we keep coming back to this topic because it's a challenging one. So that's great. So you can see that we've got for equal proportions who are either publicly committed or haven't quite gone there yet, and in the middle, groups that are not quite sure where they're at as an organisation, and that's understandable as well, and starting to consider it. So we hopefully will tip some of those who are considering it into being publicly committed by what we do today. Right, I think those polls are perfect to tee us up for the day. So let's stop right there. The polls, and we can just remove those. I'll do that. There we go. Without further ado, I'm going to move to Charlie Dixon and Hannah Murray from the GFI. Charlie, Hannah?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mark. So to explain a little bit about where the Green Finance Institute comes into this space. So we host the TNFD's UK consultation group, which is a group of around about 600 businesses in the UK, 1,400 individuals, that make sure that we keep them up to date on all of the latest updates from the TNFD, consultations, events, webinars, things like this. But we also spend lots of time with companies across lots of different sectors, helping them really just navigate any questions they have on nature and TNFD. And I've spent a lot of time with the Supply Chain School, who have been fantastic in facilitating some conversations in the built environment sector around this. So what we wanted to do today is Hannah and I wanted to take you through a whistle-stop tour of, first of all, what TNFD is. So for all of those who are just starting out or getting to grips, we're going to start right from the beginning and take it back to basics. And then a little bit of a view on what specifically this means for the built environment sector and how some of the companies are getting started. So let's start with kind of why we're thinking about this and why we're interested in looking at this in the first place. So TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for those of you who have not come across this before, is the nature equivalent of TCFD. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So it is at its heart a set of recommended disclosures that companies can make if they're looking to voluntarily report on how their business interacts with nature. And this is really important in that the focus of the framework and the guidance is to provide a really pragmatic way of thinking about the interaction with your business and nature. So it's all about really being able to put kind of terminology and measurement and dimensions around this.
So to pick up where Charlie left off, TNFD is very focused on how we can understand the dependencies and impacts that companies have on nature, and then how that arises in terms of risk and opportunities to the business. So that is kind of the framework.
So I think we can skip to the next slide as we've kind of gone through this one. So when we talk about and think about how businesses interact with nature, so these different ways that they can impact on nature, depend on nature, and whether it creates risks or opportunities for them, it's really important to remember that this is not something that's theoretical. It's not something that's conceptual or could potentially happen 10, 20 years in advance. This is something that's real and happening to businesses all around the world today. So what you have in the slide in front of you is a few of those examples where there's this fantastic study that came out from Bloomberg last year that looks at 10 different companies across the world and how they've faced real empirical financial challenges, financial losses from nature-related risks. Lots of different channels there, so some through liabilities and legal proceedings, some through credit rating downgrades, some through reputational risk causing falls in market cap. But you'll see that there's some pretty big names there. So it's Tesla, it's JBS and Bernard Matthews, which are two big food producers, PG&E, which is a large electricity utility in North America. So these risks are very real and happening and occurring to companies all around the world today. Next slide. So the other reason why an awful lot of companies are beginning to think about this is they're beginning to get requests in from their investors to say, we would love to see some details of your nature-related strategy. Are you developing a strategy? What does your risk management framework look like? And so we've just highlighted some of the policies from some of the larger global asset managers that are now asking for this as standard from their investees. So some pretty big names there: BlackRock, Aviva, Allianz, AXA, all now encouraging all of the companies that they invest in to start thinking about reporting from this framework. Next slide as well. So one thing that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on was just how the TNFD has kind of come about and what the ethos is behind it. And so the first thing to say is that it's very much rooted in the science and the academic understanding of how businesses interact with nature. So it works with a range of really leading research institutes and academic partners all from the world, all around the world that feed into this technical work. It's government supported and government backed. So the G7 and G20 have both explicitly kind of supported the work of the task force, and the recommendations have come out. But at the core of it, who is doing the actual work? It's businesses. So the task force itself is 40 different organizations across a range of different sectors. And they are the ones that have gathered the information from all of the testing, have thought about how to translate this into the recommended disclosures and guidance. So it's very much a voluntary framework that's intended for the private sector, and it's been developed by the private sector. Next slide, please. So what does it actually look like when you look under the hood? So for those of you that are familiar with and have had some experience with TCFD and, for example, climate risk assessments, a lot of this will look and feel very similar. So there are 14 recommended disclosures under TNFD, and you will see all of the ones that are highlighted in blue, so the blue dots on the right, are almost exactly the same as what you see within TCFD. So actually, there's been pretty much like a cut and paste job, you can imagine, where the wording from TCFD has been used exactly, but just replacing climate-related risk drivers with nature-related risk and opportunity drivers. And that's very deliberate. It's not people being lazy. It's people wanting to make this as tractable and as easy to do as possible. So those teams within your organizations that have worked on TCFD in the past will know how to navigate these and won't be starting from square one when they look at it. Now, there are some new bits in there. So the 3 green dots that you see are the additional disclosures relative to TCFD. And so there's one on engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities, very important in lots of nature-related activities and projects. There is one on understanding where you are interfacing with particular ecosystems. So that's a real focus on figuring out where are the location of all my operations? Where's the location of actors within my supply chain? Because we know nature-related impacts and risks are very location specific. So it's really important to understand where this is happening. And then finally, value chains. So it's very clear in the science that the biggest impacts and risks occur upstream in the supply chain. And so it's really important for us to have that understanding those upstream impacts as part of our long-term goal right from the beginning. So in some ways, for those of you familiar with TCFD, TNFD is almost starting with the equivalent of scope 3. Of course, recognizing we need to overcome data issues and we don't know everything straight away, but we're recognizing that we need to get to that point in order to capture the most important impacts. And next slide. So within the TNFD framework, I won't go into the detail here, but I just wanted to highlight something called the LEAP approach. And this is essentially a step-by-step process that any company can follow to generate all of the information that's required to fill in the disclosures, the 14 recommended disclosures. So this all focuses around first locating the locations of your operations and your value chain, then thinking about what are the ways that we impact and depend on nature, then understanding how does this generate a risk and opportunity for my business, and then finally thinking how would we as an organization like to respond to that. Next slide. And so the final thing in this first section that I wanted to leave you on was what's been the market response to date. So how has this been received by different organizations, different sectors, different jurisdictions around the world? So these are our latest adoption figures So these were from COP16, just at the end of October. Those were the global biodiversity and nature negotiations. And so globally, there's just over 500 companies and organizations that have adopted TNFD. What does adoption mean? It means these companies have committed to publish a report either on financial year 2024 or financial year 2025. So within the next 2 years, give or take. It's beginning to get to a stage where it's representing quite a significant share of the market. So if you look at the listed companies within that, it's around 6.5 trillion in market cap. And if you look at the asset managers, so the investors, it's almost $18 trillion globally as well. Some things that I find particularly interesting looking at this as well is the regional split. So by far the largest amount of adopters in Europe and Asia. The UK is actually the second highest country by number of adopters. And also on the right, the MSCI 1500 index, there's just under 30% of companies within that have now adopted TNFD as well. So that's just under a third of the world's largest 1500 companies. So really interesting to see how these figures have developed over the last year or so. Okay, so let's move into the next section now, where we wanted to take more of a focus on what this means for the built environment sector and what guidance there is available. So on the next slide, we have a bit of an overview on the guidance that's available specifically for this sector. So the TNFD, on top of the core recommendations, also has released sector-specific guidance. And so this guidance, both here for the engineering construction sector as well as construction materials, really lays out what are some of the most important impacts and important dependencies to think about in the built environment sector? And then also what are some of the metrics that could be associated with that? If you are looking into thinking about metrics too. There's also a paper that I think many people on the call will find really interesting around how to understand and work with your value chain as well. So that's definitely something I'd recommend you to check out. If we skip to the next slide, just a little bit of a look under the hood of what's in this guidance. It really helps you run through the LEAP assessment that I was talking about before. So the step-by-step process to identify how do you impact and depend on nature and what are your risks and opportunities. So there's an illustration of the full built environment value chain here. And this is intended to help people and organizations locate themselves within this value chain, but also understand where there may be significant impacts and dependencies with some of the different organizations that you work with as well. So it's to try and encourage this like full value chain view and spend some time understanding the connections between different businesses. On the next slide, and evaluate, it helps identify what some of the typical most material impacts and dependencies are for the construction sector. It does take a global view, but many of these will be relevant for UK and European context. So you can see here it's picking out things, for example, dependencies and impacts on water resources, so use of water and water supply, the impacts that can happen in terms of land use change, and also in real estate management, things around flood mitigation, storm mitigation. So these are really markers to help you start your journey from which you can say, which of these are relevant for my organization? Which do I think are really material for me? Next slide. Then when we come to thinking about how these translate to risks and opportunities, it's all thinking about how could this actually turn up as an impact on my financial accounts? Is it going to have an impact on my cost base? Do I see it having an impact on my revenue generation? Is it more of an operational risk where there could be a disruption to my supply chain? I could maybe potentially have delays to a project. Anything to do with this, anything to kind of understand how could it operate disrupt your day-to-day operations is something to be considered in this. So this is quite broad, but again, this is here to provide pointers for you to then think what's relevant for my organization. And so if we move on, And then finally, it's thinking about what can you as a business do for this. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the detail here, but if you do go into this guidance, you'll see lots of suggestions, for example, different actions that firms within the built environment sector can take to start reducing that impact and thinking about where they can manage some of those risks. So if we move into the last section, which is just a quick example of what this can look like in practice. So we've picked out one example on the next slide actually, there's just a bit of an overview here on the construction sector and how it's getting on relative to other sectors in the UK. So I mentioned at the beginning that we spend lots of time thinking about talking to companies across lots of different sectors. So it's really interesting to compare across. There are just two things that I wanted to point out on this, really, is the one is on the bottom row. We essentially have some of the reasons that construction businesses and built environment businesses are beginning to look at TNFD. And so we mentioned investors and ask from investors at the top of the call. But one really interesting thing that sets this sector apart is there are some requests coming in from clients as well. So especially for the contractors in the room, you may have some of your clients beginning to ask, are you doing anything on TNFD? Do you have a broader nature strategy? And a lot of this, I think, is born out of awareness that's coming from B&G. So there's lots of conversations around biodiversity net gain in the UK over the last couple of years. And now people are looking at nature more broadly as well. I'll kind of leave it there for this slide, but if you want to look into this and understand more about how construction sector companies are getting started on this, this information is all available on the UK Consultation Group website, and we'll put a link in the chat as well. And so the very final slide here is just to provide an example from one of the companies in the UK within the sector that has published a report. So Landsec has done a really, really excellent job where they've gone through this process that we've just talked about, evaluated which do we think are our most important impacts, which do we think are our most important dependencies, and they've mapped it across the different stages of their operations, so kind of where they operate in the value chain. Those are the ticks that you see on the right. And then they've actually set some targets around this as well. So you see an example of those on the next slide too. So for anyone who's interested in understanding what does this really look like in practice, I encourage you go check out their report. It's got some really interesting insights to use as inspiration if you're thinking about this yourself. And that's it. Look forward to some questions. Back to you, Mark.
Fantastic. So yeah, you can just see a few more bits there. You are going to receive all this content afterwards, folks. So you will no doubt want to kind of scour over Charlie and Hannah's content there, but also follow up on some of the links. There'll also be a recording of this event. So I'm just flipping through some of these. Yeah, there we go. So we come to Ben Stone of Kier, who is coincidentally the chair of the school nature recovery group, and Ruth Voigt of Laing O'Rourke. And I'll pass on to Ben and Ruth to speak. Would you like to share your slides, Ben and Ruth?
Yes, please, Mark. Okay, great. Here we go. So, as you just heard, I'm Ben. I'm Group Head of Environment for Kier, and I also chair the Nature Group for the school. Ruth's with me, and in a similar role to me, but for Laing O'Rourke. We have tried our best to create a sort of combined presentation. So we are both adopters of TNFD, and it was announced at COP16 earlier in the year. So we were 2 of the 11 UK businesses to adopt at the conference, which is great. We're just going to talk through a little bit about our sort of journey so far and how we've been getting on. It's kind of very similar, the work that we've been doing. Although we've done it in complete isolation, we've been on quite a similar journey when we spoke. So it comes together quite nicely. And we thought it might be useful for you to understand how we've gone about it into sort of tier 1 contractors. Before we sort of move on, the only other thing I wanted to say was this is quite acronym heavy, this presentation. And it's kind of unavoidable. I'm going to try to say everything, but I will probably fall into alphabet soup at some point throughout the presentation. So just bear with us a little bit. Mark, could we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so the first thing I wanted to just talk about was where disclosure and reporting is going in the UK particularly. So on the left-hand side, you can see where we are now. And on the right-hand side, in about FY28, that's when we're expecting to see nature disclosure pretty much aligned to TNFD coming into force mandatorily. And the reason for that is that the UK has adopted the International Sustainability Reporting Standards from the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And the way they are implementing them in the UK is through the Sustainable Disclosure Regulations. So they've started with climate, and then they're going to do material sustainability impacts of your business, so the most important sustainability topics. And then the third section, which they're just about to go out and in draft and publish and consult on next year, will be nature. So the UK will come and enforce mandatorily climate disclosure aligned to TCFD. Then they'll do the material sustainability impacts, and then they'll do nature. We're expecting nature to come in from about FY28. The other stuff on this slide to talk about is that CDP, which a lot of you on the call will probably disclose to, from next year, they are mandating that you have to respond to all of the surveys. So if you're like Kia at the moment, we only respond to the climate survey. And next year, we're going to have to add on forests and water and biodiversity and plastics. And there's massive alignment between TNFD and those CDP surveys. So you're going to start to see stakeholders, investors, clients who look at CDP asking for more of that TNFD data coming through. So really important. This is an emerging topic. And the final thing I wanted to say on this slide was around nature positive pledges. So that's another aligned work stream. So our peers like Balfour Beatty and BAM have signed the Nature Positive Pledge. And really all of this action, whether it's Nature Positive Pledge or TNFD, it's all about trying to get businesses to play their part for the government commitment of 30% of land and sea protected for nature by 2030. So all of them are aligned, all of them are pushing in the same direction. Whichever step you take, it gets you ready in advance to that mandatory nature disclosure. Let's go on, Mark, please. So you can see I shamelessly stole this from Charlie, this slide, but it's good that we are aligned in some way, shape or form. All I will add over what Charlie said was you've got those 14 recommended disclosures which are aligned to TCFD. The only 3 that are new, like Charlie said, are engagement with local communities, which we all do in the construction sector. So you talk to your local community before you do a project because you need to understand you don't want any problems with them as you go through the development process. We don't have any Indigenous communities in the UK. So in terms of UK operations, you don't need to worry about Indigenous communities. Where you do is in your supply chains, or if you're like Ruth and you operate across the world. The other 2 that are there, so interfacing with priority locations. So that's if you are in an area where it's water stressed or there's a really protected habitat, you need to think about it. And the reason that's different from climate is if you emit a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, it's a ton of carbon, it doesn't really matter where it is. For nature, if you cut down a bit of woodland where there's no woodland in that local area, you remove that habitat entirely. So it's really important that you have a location focus. And then, like Charlie said, value chains, absolutely essential as well to think about. So where do we have impacts in our value chain? Upstream in our supply chain, but also downstream, the projects that we build, the handover to the companies that are going to be managing those projects over the life cycle so that they maintain any habitats that we create. Okay, Mark, if we skip on again, please. Again, so CDP, I've mentioned this a little bit already, and just click once more, Mark. I think there's a bit of animation on this slide. I'm hoping there is. No, there's not. Okay, so if we go back one, sorry, I've obviously not given you the right slide. So CDP have done a bit of mapping against TNFD, and you can go onto the CDP website. I'll put the link to this report in the chat after the presentation, and you can see all the questions in CDP and how they align to the disclosure recommendations in TNFD. So you can really see really clearly if you're going to respond to CDP, exactly how much you're complying with TNFD. And there's about 85% alignment. So CDP is voluntary. You don't need to respond to all the questions, but you are going to start to be pushed in that direction by investors and shareholders. Okay, thanks, Mark. Let's go on to my final slide for this morning. So I wanted to just give you something with loads of text on it. So luckily you're going to get these slides afterwards, so you'll be able to look at them and actually read it. But this is where Kia has got to so far. So the TNFD recommendations are across the top, the governance, the strategy, the risk and impact management, the metrics and targets. If you are anything like Kia, we don't have a nature governance framework. We don't have a climate governance framework. We have a sustainability governance framework, which picks up climate and social value and nature and all the other sustainability topics which have massive overlaps. So our sustainability governance framework basically covers nature already. So we can lift and shift from TCFD onto TNFD in our disclosure. For the strategy piece, Charlie covered a bit of this, but there's some really great free resources out there. So if you're going to do your assessment and look at where your really important topics are, use the resources that TNFD provides. So the Encore database and the Science-Based Targets for Nature, they go through and look at activities and impacts and rate them by sector on how important they are. So that gives you a really good start when you're thinking about your business operations and how you assess them. And WWF have published a risk filter suite, which is a map which shows water and nature sensitivity globally. And you can drop your locations on there and see that location impact. How close are you to a protected habitat? And what do you need to do to protect that locally? And then just one final point on this, because I realise I'm going on a bit. Risks and impact management and metrics and targets. You don't have to comply with them all at once. TNFD allows you to do a bit at a time. You don't have to go to full compliance straight away. So Kia, we already report on carbon and water and waste and environmental incidents. So, you know, those are great metrics for nature. But when we start to look at some of the recommended focuses like invasive and protected species, we don't have metrics on those. We have an environmental management system that ensures we protect protected species and we manage invasive species effectively. So we will talk descriptively about the management systems to control those risks and opportunities and not put a metric on them. And then the next steps there you can read at your leisure after the session. And I will hand over to Ruth to go through her section.
Amazing. Thanks, Ben. If you just get to the next slide, there should be some animation. That's it. Oh, sorry. Just go back one. So just really picking up on everything that Ben said, our logic has pretty much followed the same lines as Kia, but our journey has probably been a little bit different. And the reason for that is we're not a listed company, and therefore much of our sustainability related reporting and disclosure has been voluntary, at least until a certain point. That said, we do recognise that tackling sustainability related issues is important to us as a business, and it's important to our people, and therefore it's also important to people like funding providers and our clients. So we've always, whilst we haven't had that regulatory driver necessarily, we have opted to aim for best practice, and therefore we are, like with our TNFD adoption, we do move early generally. And we've seen a lot of momentum around that, and it's across our group level. So we operate both in the UK, but also Australia and the Middle East. And the great thing about being a TNFD adopter is that you can start slow. Just as Ben said, at Laing O'Rourke, we are focusing initially on integrating our reports with our TCFD disclosure. And we are going to start with the governance and strategy pillars in the most part. Go to the next slide, please. So the work that we've done to date, so we kind of started, we didn't know really where to start. So we started with the same kind of focus we'd had on carbon. So we looked at our business, and it was really important for us to kind of like map what our value chain looked like. So we started from a position like this, looking at our direct operations, what they meant for us, our upstream and downstream. Most of the work we've done to date is in that direct operations and upstream space, and we've still got more work to do in the downstream. However, we did start to apply the LEAP approach. And as Ben said, that meant that we had to locate how our business interface with nature. We looked at our dependencies and impacts on nature, and then we started to assess our nature-related risks and opportunities so that we could prepare to respond to those, and then we could look at appropriate targets, reporting and disclosure. And again, just to summarize, this is kind of where we started our journey. So go to the next slide. Specifically around our direct operations, without a doubt, we have an impact on biodiversity and nature. And in our initial study of 21 sites, we worked out that approximately 4 were high risk, and a couple more were of medium risk. Now, none of them had no risk. You know, everything has at least a negligible risk in terms of its impact on nature. And the impact pathways we identified as the most significant were surrounding disturbance, water pollutants, and the use of terrestrial ecosystems. So land use change, no surprises probably around water pollution potential, but also the disturbance of our operations is something that actually could be quite simple, looking at noise, dust, the way we set up our sites and the way we operate. It's also really important, though, that we don't forget that our operations also depend on nature. For example, many of our sites, including our factories, are dependent on both resources and water to operate. And so we've really tried to change the narrative on how we also depend on nature to operate as a business, and include that in corporate governance, so we can then really fully understand the risk and opportunities to our business. And therefore, we must, in order to fully understand it, shift to looking at those impacts and dependencies on a location-based approach. And it's clear that those nature impacts and dependencies will be different depending on location. So we've had to change the way that we operate as a business to collect that information and understand it. So go to the next slide. As part of that work, we also looked at opportunities to enhance nature. So we don't own many sites, but of those we do, we looked at our potential. And one example is our Centre of Excellence for Modern Construction in Nottinghamshire. And as part of that, we became a business partner of the Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust and worked with their ecological consultancy to undertake initial baseline surveys, so that we could understand our biodiversity value. And following that, we developed a biodiversity action plan, we implemented recommendations, and then we undertake annual reviews to look at the impact our actions are having, but then also look at where we need to change and modify the management prescriptions that we're putting in place. And we already capture environmental performance data for the facility, but we've started to look at actually it not just from a carbon perspective in terms of carbon reduction opportunities, but also a broader opportunity of how we can either make enhancements or reduce our impacts. Next slide, please. Switching to the upstream lens, where do we start? So we used a similar approach that we did with carbon, and we looked at the commodities of which attract the most spend. So we landed on 7 key commodities for us to research further. And for each commodity, we then conducted a hotspot analysis, which involved mapping the production process for each of those commodities. And that helped us identify the raw materials used and what processes were involved in their production. We then used the Encore tool to analyse those associated impacts and dependencies. And those findings found that key impact drivers were different from our direct operations. Most significantly, land use change, water use, greenhouse gas emissions and pollutants. And in terms of our dependencies, we had a key reliance on water, climate regulation and kind of land stabilisation. So really interesting lenses for us to explore further. If we go to the next slide, please. We've obviously done all that work mapping our impacts and dependencies, but one of the things we were also looking at when we looked at TNFD adoption was actually how are we going to start applying metrics and targets. And as Ben mentioned, we collect a lot of data already. So what we did was we did a bit of a gap analysis against the TNFD sector guidance. And of the 23 metrics in that guidance, we found that we already collected some data on about 16 of them. However, only 8 were actually collected in a centralised way. And so we've got a lot of work to do. And the reason for us going slow in our TNFD disclosure is that we do really want to learn some of the lessons that we have learned from climate and our approach to carbon. And we want to work with our peers to support our supply chain to try and align our data ask, so what data we're asking people to report on. And we can do that by sharing an understanding of actually what metrics are we all going to routinely collect and how are we going to evidence that? What data do we need? And so the Supply Chain Score is already supporting us in a working group where a number of our peers are working together to actually advance that that piece of work so that we can start getting to some kind of alignment that allows us to move forward and hopefully minimise the impact we have on our supply chain whilst maximising value. Okay, next slide, please.
this is back to me. So Mark, can you just click on once more, please? Hopefully there's some text there. Well, it looks like no. So it's turned black for some reason. So I'm going to go to my own version of it that I've got open, and I'm just going to tell you what our key takeaways were because it's not on the slide. When you get a copy, the text will be white and you'll be able to see it. So basically, key takeaways, 6 of them. TCFD and TNFD and CDP are really closely aligned. So if you're doing disclosure on TCFD or CDP already, you're probably doing quite a lot of what you need to for TNFD. You're probably also operationally doing quite a lot already. So on carbon, on waste, on protecting water and making sure you're not abstracting too much. So you're already probably doing quite a lot which benefits nature, and it's really trying to focus on those most important things you can do additionally. And the LEAP approach really gives you that insight. So you can go through that assessment and then put operational actions in place to take the next step. You can start small. So you don't have to do everything all at once. And location is really, really important. So think about where you're working. If you start now, it gives you a head start. It's going to become mandatory in the next sort of 5 years. So be ready and make sure that you can get going and you don't have to go from 0 to full compliant disclosure all at once. And the other thing to say, which is really important, is Ruth and I and our other peer tier 1 companies and some large house builders have come together recently, and we've been talking about how we have a consistent approach. So over the coming months, through the Nature Group with Supply Chain Schools, with UKGBC, with the GFI, we will be looking at what good looks like for our sector. Where should we focus so that we can have the biggest benefit for nature and make sure we're protecting it effectively? Because we know that if we do it together, we'll have a much bigger impact than if we try and do everything individually and go in slightly different directions. And that's it from us.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Ben and Ruth. Ben, you might be able to find a way to wangle dropping the text into the chat from that the missing link slide. And if not, everybody, don't panic, because we will share headlines with you at the end. So when the final slide deck you receive after this event, which you will get, you'll be able to see that. What we're going to do now is press on without further ado to great friends of the school, Kate Swan and Julia Baker from Mott MacDonald, and I'll leave you to introduce yourselves and take it away.
Yeah, Kate.
Brilliant. Hi everyone. My name is Kate Swan. I'm an environmental and sustainability consultant at MacDonald, not at Mott MacDonald. So yeah, hand back to you, Julia.
I'm Julia, Technical Director of Nature Services. So Kate, as a sustainability professional, you've been really part of our nature initiative and our Nature Positive initiative, which is great. So point number 1, you don't have to be an ecologist. But Kate, what has been the burning question when we started our work?
I think the key thing, and probably what a lot of people on this call are thinking, is what is nature positive, and how does a company become nature positive?
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because firstly, what is nature positive? And we've had this conversation. We spoke to so many people like, okay, we understand TNFD, fantastic. It's really helping us risk dependencies, impacts to report our disclosures, but we need to set a target. We need to set a target. And do we set a nature positive target? You know, that's the thing, isn't it? And firstly, concept of nature positive doesn't work like that. And the concept of nature positive is actually much, much better. So Kate, you and I are great fans of that IUCN document, The Role of Business is Nature Positive. We can put a link in the chat. And it's a lovely document because what it says is, firstly, nature positive is a global society goal to have more nature in the world. And I love that, because what that means is inherently we're a member of the global community. So as a business, if you want to align yourself with a global society goal, your job is to be a member of the community. So your job is to be one of service, be a member of the community. And as a member of the community, what do? We support each other, we share what we're doing. And if you want a really good example of that, shout out to the 2 presentations who's just come away, because that's the job when you're a member of a community. You say, hey, we are starting, this is what we've learned and what we're doing, and shout out to Mark and Grace at the Supply Chain School, because that's all about being a member of the community. Thanks, Kate. So one is when you're signing up to say, I'm aligning with the nature positive goal, you're a member of the community, and we are here to support you. And the lights have just gone out, so let me just share the screen. The second point is you do need to think about your impacts and dependencies, just as Ruth and Ben has gone through. So you do need to assess your impacts on biodiversity throughout your value chain. So Kate, the interesting question is when is your baseline? So we're aligning ourselves with the nature positive, but what year do we set the baseline? Because that's going to be pretty fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely. To say whether you're making a positive impact, you have to understand where you are currently or where you were. If we look at the global nature positive goal, the baseline is said to be 2020. Now, I think that what we're seeing and what discussions we've had previously is that that's not perhaps the best baseline we can have. That 2020 we were in the throes of the pandemic, and so the data we're collecting probably was skewed in certain ways that wasn't representative of our normal operations. So I think the key thing for companies now looking to understand their nature impact is looking at where do they have the data that can be used to produce their baseline. So where do you have enough data? It doesn't have to be loads, just a starting point, probably what you're already collecting for carbon disclosures and other sort of bits of operational information that you could pull together to make a sort of a starting point for your baseline. And as part of that, you can produce a gap analysis to understand where you can start to collect little bits of data to kind of make that more rigorous in terms of understanding your operations. But I think the key thing, part of the baseline that you would look to do is producing a biodiversity footprint of your operations, because that can help you sometimes start to understand where your biggest impacts are. Julia, would you like to perhaps give a bit of information about the biodiversity footprinting?
Yeah, definitely. So and Ben and Ruth brilliantly went through, as you go through the LEAP approach, you're looking at your locations and things like that. So we're starting to get in the world of what a biodiversity footprint is. Now, all we're doing really is just bringing biodiversity up to the same level as carbon, and about time, quite frankly. So think about a biodiversity footprint throughout your value chain, and absolutely you can look at your direct operations and things like that, but you do need to assess your biodiversity impacts throughout your value chain. Now, there's some really interesting work on these biodiversity footprints. They follow life cycle analysis. University of Oxford has published their biodiversity footprint. They also did the Garden as well. And we've run a couple of pilots on biodiversity footprinting, and Kate, it was really interesting, wasn't it? So just like Ruth, we actually had a lot of the data ourselves, in terms of the carbon calculation we're collecting or the recycling data we collect from our offices, to think about the biodiversity footprint. So when you look at throughout your value chain, using the data you've already got in these biodiversity footprinting tools that are emerging, it was actually really interesting to give us the kind of the headline messages and give us that overarching view in terms of where's our greatest impacts and which impacts are most material. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm in Nature Positive, I want to be part of the community, welcome. You are very welcome, and it is a community. You're aligning yourself with a global goal to become nature positive rather than, there's no badge saying you're going to be a nature positive company. You've had some really good starting points from Ben and Ruth, but at some stage, have a look at those biodiversity footprints, because it gives you a great idea and a great assessment of your biodiversity impacts throughout your value chain. Kate, the question is, when you have your biodiversity footprint, what on earth do you do with it?
Yeah, I think that's the key thing. That's like the first step in deciding how you start to align yourself with that nature positive goal. So once you have your biodiversity footprint, you can start to target what you're doing. You can see those easy, quick, big wins, potentially where you have large impacts or you have numerous small impacts. So you can make small changes throughout your supply chain, throughout your operation. You can start to align yourself with that nature positive goal and then report on that against that baseline that you've set with that biodiversity footprint. So it's all about prioritization. So what can you do now? What can you look to do in the future? And what data can you look to collect throughout it to support your journey towards that nature positive goal? So yeah.
And Kate, you've been brilliantly, you're so much part of the nature family, and I really like the way that, and thank you so much, because you really get it. But what would you say from other people out there who's thinking, well, look, I'm sustainability, I'm not an ecologist, or I'm not a technical director of nature services, to say, no, you're equally part of this nature family? What would you say to encourage people to say, no matter where you are in industry, you've got a role in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like we say that nature's a team sport. So it's not just ecology that need to be doing input. Obviously, that's a lot of the biodiversity comes into that. But nature is everything. Nature encompasses also carbon. It encompasses any of those sort of little sustainability bits that you're looking at. It's ecosystem services. It's across the whole range. And actually, nature is part of all of our jobs now. when we're looking at it, and with things like the TNFD coming through and kind of solidifying that. So all of our actions, operations in our day-to-day life will have some impact on nature, and therefore has some influence to contribute towards the nature positive goal. So I think viewing nature as a team sport, making it part of our day-to-day in just conversations, doesn't have to be a lot, doesn't have to be constantly hours and hours of meetings. It just has to be something that we're all thinking about.
Absolutely. And the other thing as well that we've been talking about is, you know, when people are thinking, okay, I've got TNFD, I've got nature positive, I can only do one, because, you know, and it's so incredible, isn't it? Like forever, we've just wanting nature on the table, and then it's just like I can really understand that people are being bombarded. Like, okay, do I do TNFD or do I do nature positive? And it's the same thing. It's just one thing, isn't it? What's your advice, Kate, for people who are thinking, okay, do I do TNFD or do I target nature positive? Where do, you know, how do people really bring that piece together?
I would say use the TNFD as a tool towards aligning yourself with that nature positive goal. The TNFD and the other resources we've mentioned, but the TNFD is this great resource, and it basically takes you through and it shows you how to evaluate your company's operations in a kind of a balanced way against nature positive or against impacts and dependencies on nature, and with the dependencies being that key aspect of understanding where you as a company are maybe like at risk from nature risk, and so understanding that and setting that up, I think that's the key thing. So the way to look at it is that you're aligning yourself with the nature positive goal using the TNFD to be that rigorous reporting metric to track your progress. I don't know, what would you say on that, Julia? Do you think?
Yeah, I think it's kind of understanding part of your principles and values as a company. Absolutely. So there is in the really exciting place when things are just starting out, you know, what an incredible moment for us as industry to really shape and influence this from, you know, a very genuine point of view. And TNFD, absolutely, it's recognized. And we're talking about this, you've always got to have that foundation of what is good practice, where am I going to start on? And in terms of the TNFD framework, absolutely. But it's what's the point? The so what? What are we actually doing? And Charlie really talked about it as well. Okay, as a business, you do have to understand your risk for nature, because if you don't, you're not going to survive. You just won't. As a thriving businesses, you really need to get with your risk, your risk to business, and how nature plays a part of that, your dependencies, but also as a thriving business, play your part, because that's also what your clients or your regulators or your shareholders are going to ask you for your target, and also your staff as well. You know, there's a rising swell, which I really love, of the ground workers who really want to work for these companies who are building the infrastructure that we need to do in ways that deliver more nature in the world. It's coming right at us. So in summary, Kate, let's go through this. So one is, am I a nature positive company? What's the answer?
Yes, everyone should be.
Exactly, but aligning yourself with the global goal for nature positive. So it's really about understanding that you're part of a community, and Karma's a part of the community, and we are right here for you. But it's going to be making that contribution to a nature positive world. The other thing is about your baseline. What's the answer?
Yep, you can start to look for it now. It's not necessarily a set year like 2020, like the global goal. It's when you have that data to make a rigorous baseline.
Exactly. So be transparent. You know, there's no right or wrong answer. It's about justifying that. If you have really dodgy data in one year, it doesn't make any sense either, but really justifying it around the international year that Kate mentioned. The other thing as well is about, as you go through and shout out the examples by Ben and Ruth by that, but biodiversity footprinting. You know, if you want that kind of overview of your impacts on biodiversity and your dependencies throughout your value chain, the biodiversity footprinting world is really exciting. It's really interesting. We're seeing that fast rise in that. And as a final point, Kate, nature's a team sport.
Absolutely. It should be part of all of our day-to-days from going forward. So
thank you very much. Mark, back to you.
Fantastic, thanks a lot. So then we're mixing it up a bit. There you go. So you get slides with a million little factoids on them, and then you get a great conversation between two experts in the field. So thanks, Kate and Julia, for that. I should also just kind of mention in passing, we ran a webinar not long ago, and I think it's available on Watchback, which covered Speedy Hire's Nature Positive Roadmap. Where they work closely with Mott on that, and it's a fantastic piece of work that Speedy have put together with support from Mott. And I would really take a look at that if you get a chance to look back at it, because it talks about practicalities of what you can do. And with practicalities in mind, I'm delighted to bring our last formal speaker to the table, and that's Gabby Graham. Gabby, I'll let you introduce yourself, and you're going to talk about the biodiversity benchmark.
Excellent. Thank you so much. What a great series of talks today. It's been brilliant listening to everyone. So what I wanted to focus on today was looking at some of those practicalities on the ground and how you can actually implement some of these measures on land that might be owned by your business. So I'm Gabby. I work for Surrey Wildlife Trust Ecology Services, and I'm also the chair of the Wildlife Trust Consultancies. And for several years now, the Wildlife Trust has put together a scheme called Biodiversity Benchmark, and it's a site-based scheme which is all about integrating environmental management systems at a site-based level, and particularly benefiting biodiversity. So if I can have the next slide, please, that would be lovely. Actually, the one after that would be even better. Thank you. So again, you've had lots of slides today, and it's a bit of a shame to be the last person presenting because you might be slide fatigued. But what I wanted to do was just kind of identify kind of very broadly how you can implement the systems in relation to biodiversity benchmark. And I think that what's really come through a lot of the discussions today was about that first step that you need to do is looking at what you've got, where your impacts are, etc., so you can actually develop those targets and prioritize your actions. So really, the biodiversity benchmark scheme is based on ISO 14001. So very much aimed at integrating into your existing systems if you are ISO accredited already. And we're not trying to add to the amount of assessments and terminology, etc. Just trying to kind of slot into these management systems, which are really important for, as Julia said earlier, kind of as a business, you do need to consider nature in your business operations, because ultimately nature will impact everything that happens as a business, and will have financial impacts in the long run if we don't tackle it proactively. So really it's looking at working with an ecologist who does look at where are your gaps, how you link to those local communities, because that's a really important element and very much links to TNFD. And then making sure that all the actions that you're undertaking as a business actually complies with various bits of legislation, which is ultimately exists to protect nature and species, etc. And then after that, the setting the targets for priority actions is about looking at making sure there's a biodiversity action plan, for example, as Ruth was talking about for Langerook and one of their sites that she was discussing, and having really clear objectives and targets. And through positive land management, then we can actually improve biodiversity at that site level. So I just wanted to, next slide, because I'm quite conscious of time. So if you can skip to the next slide, that would be lovely. Thank you. It's just a very kind of high level case study for SES Water at a particular site called Barrow Beach in Surrey. And actually it was a really interesting site because, it's quite a large piece of land. And what we did is we actually condition assessed all of the habitats that were present, which is what you can see on the right hand side, and established what that baseline is. So we really understood what the activities were on the site and how that related to its impacts on biodiversity, and looked at what the habitats condition were at that kind of baseline level, and then worked with the team to develop biodiversity management plan, etc., to actually have some proactive land management and aim to really improve those habitat conditions that we had. It was quite an important part of for that particular strategy. The idea was, so Ofwat had actually requested that biodiversity had been looked at for this site. So it actually, again, fitted in really well with kind of other kind of obligations that our particular client had in that instance. And so I think that, when you look at the way you can report some of these elements. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel each time. It's looking at what currently exists and then trying to kind of slot it in so that you can demonstrate all those benefits to biodiversity and ecology in general in kind of a really effective way, which is critical. And then just the last slide, please. Thank you. That was just, again, the details not really important. That came straight from SES Water. But what was really important with this slide and the kind of take-home message was about embedding that purpose into the business. It's not just about having a tick box exercise that you're just going through. It is a mind shift that you have to do. Nature is critical to everything, to life on Earth as a whole. And for all of our businesses to be successful in the long term, it's really important that we engage with those nature impacts and we embed them into our businesses so that we can make sure that both our businesses are protected and nature is protected in the long run. So thank you very much.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Gabby. And it's really nice at the end of the series of formal presentations to kind of bring it back home to actually practical actions that we can do. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of hand over to the panel and ask if you've got any immediate observations about each other's talks before we move to Q&A. You can get your Q&A in, folks. You can see the opportunities to do so there if you've got burning questions you would like to have answered, and we will do. But let's just throw it back to the panel for a minute. Who'd like to go?
I'll jump in. I think it's really good to hear what everybody's doing. I think there's loads of alignment across the sector, and you can see that we're really keen to work together. It's really nice to hear about the biodiversity benchmark. I think I was in, to give an example, I was in a meeting earlier in the week about nature-based solutions and climate adaptation, and Heathrow Airport were there, and they've got biodiversity benchmark and have had, they were saying, for about 16 years. And they were saying it's one of the most useful things that they can really see the recommendations being implemented, and their people that work around that site can see the difference it's making for nature and sort of well-being benefits, the nature benefits that are coming through. So they were really complimentary and sort of said, that structure and the recommendations that come from the discussions with the Wildlife Trust have changed the way they manage their land. So I think there's some really great opportunities to take sort of specific examples like that and deliver value.
Anybody else like to respond?
Just want to echo Ben in terms of that, and really recognise the biodiversity benchmark. It's such a great place to look at that, and we've obviously got the biodiversity metric to demonstrate compliance with BNG, but it just gives you so much more for that. And as you start on this, and actually Ruth, you raised a really good point in terms of, well, we don't own many sites, but we do own that one, and let's have a look at what we can do. And actually, Ruth, to ask you a question, when you were looking at kind of all of your impacts and everything, and you felt on that site, it's quite easy, I guess, was it easy to just think, oh, it's not going to be that much, is it, because we've got such a large footprint? But I love the way that you said, no, it's still a patch of nature and we can really do something. So where did that come in terms of your thinking about the importance of that site?
I think it's one of our flagship sites. I think we really considered that site as we've got a lot of people there, and a lot of our people actually connect to nature. So that piece of work started looking at actually how we could embed nature into our wellbeing schemes. So one of the things about being a partner with the Wildlife Trust is that actually we do Wild at Work days, we tie it in with our activities for World Environment Days and things like that. And so we looked at it in the bigger picture. We started by doing some kind of like lunchtime walks and nature trails and stuff around the site, and just getting people outside and reflecting. So that's kind of where it started. And then it was like, right, okay, actually, what value does this land have? And so we started doing the surveys and then looking for opportunities and kind of like trying to build on things that people knew about. So No Mow May kind of thing was one of the first initiatives that we did. And then pollination services and things like that. So we got some bees, and they actually create CMC honey and stuff. And so just really got people talking, and we thought it was really important to us to have that baseline for the site, and then report on it each year. What does it look like? How successful has that been? Do we need to adapt? Do we need to do something differently? So yeah, so that's kind of where we started really. And we have looked at other sites as well. So others where very much smaller land plots kind of thing, but actually what are the small wins that we can do? Some of the landscape planting, can we over time change some of the non-native planting to something a bit more impactful for nature? So it started a journey across our fixed facilities.
I think it's a really good example though, isn't it? Because you just kind of start and then something will just happen and people become really passionate and really loving that kind of nature space. And I do think as nature we just win the hearts and minds argument. You can look at all the other sustainability like topics, and I think with nature we've got that one. So it's a really lovely space, but also we have to make this really tangible for people and for them to just know that that's a material value for their space as well. I love the idea of nature walks at lunchtime, Kate. Let's definitely do that. I think we can find some places around London to do that. So that's great.
That's great, thanks. So we've got had a bit of a round robin from our presentations. I'm going to use like chair's privilege or whatever you call it, and just ask one question of anybody in the panel who dares to take it on. I'm a small medium business. I'm in supply or subcontracting to typical school partners, which might be tier 1 contractors, might be FM service providers, might be a utility or a real estate investment trust or anything else in between. What do I do today or tomorrow to get started on this?
I can go. I think start a conversation. As principal contractors, we can't do it all alone. We are so dependent on our value chain. And so we appreciate that everyone won't have the answers, but actually starting a conversation, talking about actually what's important to you, where you think opportunities might lie, kind of thing, and moving from there. I think, talking about it is a massive place to start.
Yeah, and Mark, one thing that you can do, start to map out your value chain as well, just as we said, because then you can start to map, okay, where do you interface with nature? And I mean, the TNFD has got some really helpful guidance on that, because as Kate said, it's going to be a question of really understanding where's your interfaces with nature. You will know where your risks to a business are. So as these things pop up, as you're mapping your supply chain, I know that's my risk and what's around nature with that, because chances are the two are going to be quite interrelated in dependencies. Then when you've got, and it can be really high level, like a high level value chain map, and you start to map your interfaces with nature, your impacts, your risk, your dependencies, it really starts to come into place quite quickly. You can just really see that. And there's some examples of that already, but also Mark, as a member of the community, give us a shout out and we can go through this with you. Because when you start to see, I've got an impact on nature there, but actually I've got a real risk to my supply chain there, and that's one of my dependencies on nature, then you start to get what Kate was saying about, you can start to build up that level of priorities.
Thanks for that. And I mean, just something I'd add in is that there ought to be no shortage of willing volunteers, because who doesn't like nature?
Mark, I'm just gonna on that. So I think they were great answers. What I would say though is there's some, we can see within our supply chain, depending on the type of supply. So if it's a material supplier, we want to know the materials are protecting nature. And that is the supply chain stuff that Julie was talking about. That's great. If it's a subcontractor operating on our sites, there's a lot of stuff that we've been doing for a long time which are getting more important with climate change. So if you are a ground worker working for Kia or for Lang or for Balfours or for anybody else, we're going to see warmer, wetter winters. We're going to see muddier sites. We're going to see challenges with pollution running off sites into watercourses. We need you guys to help us manage that. So that's going to be a really key sort of competency that we need to improve. We're going to see more challenges with invasive and protected species on our jobs, where climate change is impacting either those protected species habitats and their viability, or causing invasive species to spread more. So we need you to help us, and we need you to be competent to come and manage those on our sites. So there's some really core stuff, which is sort of the fundamental building blocks of sustainability, the environmental sort of compliance piece, that is only going to get more important with this agenda, with the nature and climate emergency, and that we're going to need you to really help with.
Yeah, and I know we're going to move on, but I think that's really important. I think don't be afraid of when a big company like ours ask for a tender response. I know everyone will think I need to be compliant and I need to offer kind of like a bid that is comparable to my peers. However, do not be afraid to also propose an alternative offer. So if you think you can do something differently, you can have a positive impact, you might have some innovation or a product that you think will be of interest to us, don't be afraid to also suggest that, because that can start a conversation. So yeah, be bold, and when you do know stuff and you think you've got something to offer, absolutely share that with us.
A lot. Right, we better get into the questions, because as ever happens, questions start to come reeling in right at the end, and we've got some great ones. Here's one from Alan Whiteside. He says, given the relevance of the public sector and that they also may be clients of some of the businesses, is there examples of TNFD in the public sector, or would they require bespoke metrics?
I can provide a bit of a view on that. There's also one or two questions that were asked similar to this that have been answered already in the Q&A function. So do have a look at those. So TNFD is intended as primarily a voluntary framework for the private sector. So it's starting largely with private sector businesses and other organizations that will find it useful. Now, what we saw on the journey with TCFD in climate is that over time, some different types of public organizations found it helpful, and now actually many of the UK government departments do generate and publish TCFD reports. So I think over time, we might begin to see that with TNFD, but the answer is where we are at the moment, we're just still very, very early on in the journey. So the recommendations have only been published for a year or so. But I know that there are many conversations happening around different types of government departments, arm's length bodies, and kind of quasi-public organizations saying, how is this going to be helpful for me? Because from a private sector point of view, it's helpful to get a really core understanding of your risks and opportunities. It's helpful to communicate your progress to investors and potentially prepare for if you think there could be mandatory disclosures down the line. So the question as it comes to public organizations is, how is this helpful for me? Where do I get my revenues and my cost from? Where is it going to interact with some of the things that are important for my organization? So no examples just yet, but there may well be some in the next few years.
Thanks for that. Right, okay, we'll consider that.
I'll just, what I would say is we're seeing a lot of collaboration with government agencies like National Highways, the Environment Agency. They're involved with the school, and we talk to them about nature quite a lot individually and then in working groups. So while they might not be getting ready to disclose on TNFD, they're really focused on a lot of the same issues as us, because it's their project and it's their land, and they're going to have to manage it for a long time. So they want sustainable solutions, and they're looking for us to sort of push in the same direction. So while they may not disclose, they're all talking about the same things. So it's coming downstream from public sector through tier ones and into supply chains.
Thanks for that, Ben. Right, I'm going to move on to the next question. Nick Allard, we can probably all disclose a good project-related story around Nature Positive, but are there any examples of disclosure on some of the inherent challenges to the sector? So, bit of a googly being bold there. So, who's going to take that one on?
I'll give a Kia example to start with, if that's all right. So, what I would say is we've talked about a load of overlap coming between TCFD and TNFD. If you look at the Kia TCFD report, you'll see there's a load of physical climate risks in there, and that's a risk to nature as well. So you will see a lot of alignment between a TCFD report and a TNFD report as they're published, and you'll see that it probably flows in the same format. So have a look at the TCFD reports from the sector and the principal contractors. You will see, a lot of alignment between climate risks and nature risks, and I think that's probably the best example you'll get right now.
Thanks for that. Anybody else want to add anything, or should we move to the next question?
Maybe the only thing I would add is that the typical approach that most companies are taking is, as Julia explained and Ruth and Ben pointed to as well, is taking this first step to say, across my operations and value chain, what do I think are the 1, 2, 3 most important things to focus on, and then exploring that further. So really trying to figure out, do I think this is a risk? Let's play through some different potential future scenarios and think how this could operate my business, impact my business. So what we'll do is we'll pop in the chat the repository of published TNFD reports that's kept on the TNFD website. And within that, you'll see lots of examples of companies taking this approach. And so it's almost identifying what are the things that we want to look into further. And quite often they're a mix of these challenges and opportunities.
Thanks for that, Charlie. I mean, I've said before, right at the start, we will be returning to this topic. You can't knock this off in an hour and a half, can you? You know, it's never going away, and it's only going to get bigger and better. So we'll come back to that. I think that's a great topic, actually. The whole issue around, you know, the challenging areas, the risk areas, and it might be, you know, subject matter for a future event like this. But let's move to Simon Matthews from the UK Green Building Council, and says, with climate, we have a clear target, what we need to do around carbon. Do we have emerging targets around nature beyond 30 by 30? What do we need to do to truly restore a balanced natural world?
Can I pick up some of those elements? I think that particularly around restoring a balanced natural world, I think it's about making sure that we have resilience within the habitats that exist. So, you know, over years of people and, you know, keep impacting our natural environment, it has meant that those habitats are less able to deal with kind of further changes. So between climate change and pollution, etc., it's kind of further impacting those habitats. So it's about trying to have habitats that are functioning in the way that they should be functioning, and limiting how much more we kind of keep throwing at them to see how much you know, they can keep responding, because eventually those habitats just won't be able to come back to functioning as they should. So I think it's not a black and white answer. It's just about making sure that all of those habitats are basically functioning in the way they should be.
Thanks for that, Gabby. I think that's a good response. We'll move on to the next question from Lizzie Staincliffe. I'd be interested in the setup of teams that work on this. How many people, how much resource do you need really to have to work on this? It's a good question, because it sounds like, you know, quite a lot of requirements. Anyone?
On TNFD, if I start, I'm sure Ruth and I take a slightly different approach on this, but I've said this to some people on the call. We have done it internally so far. We've got sort of a small core team of sustainability professionals that have worked on our TNFD draft disclosure. We've had we sort of did the desk-based stuff, reviewing what we thought, shared it around our people, and then we've had 2 half-day meetings in a dark room, which both the feedback I've had, they are migraine inducing, but have great outcomes, because it is quite technical, and it does require you to focus and
Ben,
think.
you're not selling it.
No, I know.
Thanks, Ben.
But
everything was going so well.
And then we come out and we're like, oh, we've actually got something brilliant. But it's a bit painful to get there, in all honesty. It's not simple. You do have to think about this stuff. So we've done it internally so far. We will go out and work with somebody to do sort of an expert review coming out the back of that process, because we do need somebody just to check that we're not too clear bias. Yeah, you can. There's some really great resources from TNFD that Charlie and Hannah have been putting in the chat. Go to those first, lock yourself in a dark room and read them for a while, and then get some interested people together in a room and know your business, and you can get a long way in terms of doing that gap analysis, I think.
Yeah, and just to quickly come in, sorry, but really quickly, I think it relates to, you know, what Kate was saying as well. You know, it's actually, you're probably not going to speak to the ecologist first time around, because you need to understand the materiality and the risks and impacts. And then exactly that, if you do have a site, you know, the biodiversity benchmark, but that's one part of it. But it's understanding everyone within your business actually has a role to play in that nature conversation. Ruth? Yeah,
I was just gonna build on that. That's exactly it. I think you know, as principal contractor, we have a small team of sustainability professionals that don't work out on our sites, and we've mobilized those, and we did utilize a consultant to help us work through that journey. We did have kind of cross-functional workshops. So we did use those people within our business that are best placed to help us. And then when we look at the facilities as well, we identify the opportunity, but we hand that over to the facilities, and actually it's driven by the people who work in those locations. So so we've used more consultants than Ben has at Kier to date, but we've used that as our baseline, and then we've built on it. Whereas I think Ben's looking at doing it the other way around. So there's no right answer.
Okay, right, 3 open questions, and we've got a closing poll to do. So we are going to do this, folks. I'm determined now. Rachel Blackwell says, I work for an archaeology company, so not directly the built environment. Are there any means of collaboration with companies in the built environment for greater impact?
Supply Chain School Working Group.
Yeah, sounds like it, doesn't it? Yes.
And just to add, you have a seat at the Nature Positive table. You absolutely have a seat at the Nature Positive table. Map your value chain. Think about where your, the electricity that you use, the food that you, with your offices, the PPE that you buy, all of that has an impact on nature. So absolutely be part of this brilliant working group head up by Ben, but also have a think about the impact of your company and your operations on nature, and join us. And
also protecting environments and the habitats around those environments in the sense of architecture and heritage. Really interesting stuff. Another webinar's worth there somewhere down the line. Charlie Davis has a long question. I'll be interested to see the relationships with a wider range of land managers can be established through this framework. Is there a focus on delivery by NGOs who are significant LOs? Don't know what an LO is, but hopefully you do. But what will be interesting is if this generates opportunities for partnerships with private, institutional, and community LOs can deliver nature restoration off the back of the partnerships prompted by this reporting. However, we are aware that the majority of the industries in the UK will have impacts abroad, more so than in the UK. Very true, I think, in lots of cases. So this won't be a silver bullet for delivering nature restoration in the UK. Governments are farming this as solutions to fill the funding gap in the public purse for nature restoration, but perhaps this is naive. Can the panel comment? Over to you, panel.
Could I take some of that? I think so. LO, I believe, is a landowner, so I thought that would be helpful. But yes, acronyms can be a bit challenging sometimes. So I think what's really important, and I get that comment about kind of impacts in other countries, and that's really critical for a lot of the kind of materials and things like that people are using for their businesses. But I think what's really important is actually those local communities, and also I think Ruth was talking about kind of getting the facilities to deal with some of these. So staff engagement is really critical, because people are very passionate about nature, and those local communities, they have so much will in the world. Like, we work a lot with local communities, and they often just want to do things. They're seeing what's happening in the world and they want to act, but a lot of them don't really know how to act. And I think it's about supporting those local communities as a very start, looking at the UK focus, to be able to have the resources that they need so that they can act, because they're just an excellent boot on the ground. And if they've got the right resource in place, whether it's guidance, whether it's, sometimes they might need some tools to help them do their the work on their land, etc. And it's all of that engagement is really critical, and making sure that they're engaged, because then it has a kind of a long-term lasting effect on nature and on other kind of social aspects when you're looking at well-being and those local communities. So I think that there is no silver bullet, but it's all of those elements working together, whether it's businesses doing that, local communities, etc., that I think collectively we're having a much larger impact.
Lovely answer, Gabby. Thank you. 2 more questions. Come on, we are going to do this, folks. Noel Kirby, how do you determine reliably and honestly that your supply chain is not contributing to any negative impacts on Indigenous communities in other parts of the world?
I'll give an example for this. So we worked with the Supply Chain School and a number of our peers to look at HVO last year and how we assure the supply chain's there, because there's been loads of problems with land use change and Indigenous communities and slavery risks in sort of the palm oil industries. And we got to a point where we had agreed what good looks like in terms of that assurance. So where there is a big material key risk, we're entirely up for working with our peers to try and develop that sector guidance. But for HVO, it's certification, It's understanding that it's only coming from waste. It's making sure that we test so it's not being blended with fossil fuels. So we can put, depending on the commodity, we can put controls in place that manage it, but we need to work together to work out what they are. Because if we have it consistently across the sector, then we make sure that all of it's improving, and it's not just Kia or Marigold that are doing it individually.
Yeah, so it's about collective efforts, isn't it, and taking responsibility. So thanks for that. Final question, Kate Ryder saying CPD and TNFD. Here we go, back to our acronym soup. I've just asked a colleague about the overlap between the two. They confirmed biodiversity isn't going to be marked next year. Is that right?
I don't know if we know the answer to that.
No.
I think the rumours are it wasn't scored this year again. So I think this is the second or third year now that biodiversity has been there but hasn't been scored. Our understanding is it's likely that it will be scored next year. However, I can't give any confirmation to that, Ben. I don't know if you can.
No, I agree. I think I mean, you have been able to just do climate in previous years and not do forests or water. They are merging all the surveys into one. So that's plastics and biodiversity are in that. Now, I think they're scoring a whole lot, but I would have to go away and check that within our own business as well and maybe ask the question. CDP come back, if you email them, they'll tell you.
Well, we'll do our best to keep people informed through the group. It's a collective enterprise, but very much like Julia said, you know, we've all got a stake in the game. So let's try and work together. And if you hear anything, let us know. Just want to say, Mark Southgate said that the principles in the Sir John Lawton report are helpful and simple for what to have in mind to have positive impacts on habitats. Get better, more joined up. That should be something to look into for us. What I would like to do now is run our final poll to see if we've made any difference with you all. So, Alice, are you able to launch the final poll? Oh, getting to grips with it. It's flying here, folks. You've obviously done a good job. So you've earned that cup of tea, I would say. That's interesting, isn't it? I think there is a difference there. And we've got a few more looking to lead, which is even more promising. So we've got people who are so enthused by what they've heard, they're going to come out there and lead. So, it's just shrunk down again. But no, you get the point. I think we made a little bit of a difference. We hope we have. This is a massive topic. We can't cover it in 90 minutes, but we've done our best. I'm just going to leave it for any. Actually, I'm going to pass over to the panel. Anybody who's got any closing comments? We've got a minute, and take it from there.
I was going to say thank you, Mark. We really appreciate these webinars that you run because it is a community. And if anyone is out there struggling, do join us. This is a fantastic group, and it's all about coming together. It's all about sharing. It's all about starting the nature conversation. And Charlie, your group as well is fantastic. And I think if we really bed in as a community, so look, no one is expecting you to be nature positive tomorrow or to do TNFD tomorrow, but we are expecting you to join us, to talk about it, to ask your questions. And I think together we can really do something.
Thank you. Anybody else? I mean, top that if you can.
Julia said it all.
Yeah, of course you did. Always bang on the money. Listen, particular thanks to all of our panel members. Thanks to you as an audience for sticking with us. Thanks for being responsive, asking really, good questions, incisive questions. We're going to finish bang on time, and I'll call that job done if nothing else. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.